You want to know what it feels like to rise from the dead? To watch the blood drain from your enemies' faces when they see a ghost they thought they'd buried forever? I'll tell you. I walked into that courtroom behind my son, Mateo, watching him struggle with those damn crutches, each step a reminder of how far we'd fallen. The wooden doors creaked behind us like the gates of judgment opening, and when that judge looked up from his papers, when his eyes met mine across that sea of mahogany and marble, I saw something I hadn't seen in 20 years. Fear. "Mrs. Alvarez," his voice cracked like autumn leaves, "you're alive?" The gasps that rippled through that courtroom sounded like waves breaking against rocks. I watched Carla's face, my son's ex-wife, that predator in designer clothes, turn the color of old milk. Her lawyer's mouth fell open like a fish pulled from water, drowning in air thick with shock. That was the moment the past I had buried came crawling back to life, clawing its way out of the grave where I'd left it to rot. That was the moment Elena Alvarez, stepped back into the light. But before I tell you how we got there, before I show you how justice can sleep for decades and still wake up hungry for vengeance, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because I want to know how far stories of justice can travel, how many hearts still beat for truth in this world gone mad with greed. You could taste the tension in that courtroom like copper on your tongue. The wooden benches groaned under the weight of spectators who'd come to watch my son get devoured. Reporters whispered in corners like vultures circling carrion, their notebooks ready to document another broken man's fall from grace. My Mateo sat there in silence, his head bowed like he was praying or preparing for execution. I wanted to reach over and lift his chin, to remind him of the warrior I'd raised, but I knew this was his battle to face first. Those crutches leaned against his chair like sentinels, like the only friends he had left in a world that had turned its back on him. Across that narrow aisle, might as well have been an ocean, sat Carla. My God, how she'd changed. Gone was the sweet girl who used to braid my granddaughter's hair and call me Mama Elena. In her place sat a stranger in a $1,000 suit. Her lips painted blood red, her eyes sharp as surgical instruments. She smirked like she'd already won, like she'd already counted the money from selling my son's house. Our house, the house built with his sweat and my tears. Her attorney shuffled papers with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a case he shouldn't have won. I could see it in his posture, in the way he glanced at Mateo like he was looking at a lame horse ready for the glue factory. He had his arguments prepared. My son was unfit, disabled, unable to care for a child or maintain property. He had his narrative polished and ready. The judge cleared his throat, and the sound echoed through that chamber like thunder before a storm. "Let's begin," he said, and I felt my heart begin its war drums against my ribs. Little did they know, the real storm hadn't even started yet. You want to understand why that house meant everything? Why I was willing to come back from the dead to fight for it? Then you need to know what it cost to build. I was 23 when Mateo's father walked out on us. 23 with a 2-year-old son and a law degree I'd earned by studying under streetlights because we couldn't afford to keep the electricity on. Miguel took one look at our struggles and decided he'd rather chase dreams in California than face reality in Chicago. "I'm not cut out for this, Elena," he said, standing in our doorway with a suitcase and the smell of another woman's perfume clinging to his clothes like guilt. "I need to find myself." Find himself, as if he'd lost himself somewhere between changing diapers and paying rent, as if responsibility was a prison instead of a privilege. I wanted to scream that we all lose ourselves when we become parents. That's the point. We die so our children can live. But I said nothing. I just watched him walk away and promised myself that Mateo would never know what it felt like to be abandoned by someone who was supposed to love him unconditionally. The years that followed were a blur of double shifts and sleepless nights. I worked as a public defender during the day, fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, and waited tables at an all-night diner when the courthouse closed. My hands were permanently stained with coffee and ink. My back ached from bending over law books and carrying trays. But I never stopped moving. I sold my wedding ring, that thin band of gold that had promised me forever, to pay for Mateo's books when he started kindergarten. I sold my grandmother's china to buy him school clothes. I sold pieces of my past, one by one, to build his future. There were nights when I sat at our kitchen table after Mateo had gone to sleep, surrounded by case files and unpaid bills, and I would weep. Not for myself, never for myself, but for the weight of carrying another person's dreams on shoulders that were already bent from carrying my own. But then morning would come, and I would see my son's face, bright with hope and trust, and I would find the strength to carry both of us another day. When Mateo graduated high school as valedictorian, I cried tears that tasted like vindication. When he got his construction license and started his own company, I felt pride so fierce it could have powered the city. And when he brought home the blueprints for a small brick house on the edge of Milwaukee, when he spread those papers across our table and said, "This is for you, Mom. You'll never be homeless again," I knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. That house wasn't just brick and mortar. It was every night I'd gone to bed hungry so he could eat. It was every Christmas I'd worked instead of celebrated. It was every dream I'd deferred, every want I'd ignored, every piece of myself I'd sold to make him whole. That house was my son's love made manifest in the world, and I'd be damned if I'd let some gold-digging vulture tear it down for profit. 3 years ago, my son fell from a scaffolding 23 feet high. 23 feet, the same age I was when his father left us. Funny how numbers follow you through life like ghosts, marking the moments when everything changes. I got the call at 3 a.m, some stranger's voice telling me that Mateo was at General Hospital, that I should come quickly, that it was serious. I drove through empty streets with my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape. When I saw him in that hospital bed, wrapped in tubes and wires, his leg twisted at an angle that made my stomach turn, I felt something die inside me. Not hope, never hope, but innocence. The belief that good people are protected from random cruelty, that hard work shields you from life's casual violence. The doctors spoke in medical terms that meant nothing and everything: partial paralysis, nerve damage, permanent disability, significant rehabilitation required. They spoke about my son like he was a broken machine instead of a man who'd built houses with his bare hands, who'd carried me through my darkest nights, who'd loved his wife and daughter with the fierce devotion of someone who'd learned too young that love is fragile and fleeting. Carla played the devoted wife for exactly 6 weeks. I watched her bring him meals he couldn't eat, help him with therapy exercises that left him exhausted and demoralized. She smiled for the nurses and held his hand for the cameras when the local news did a story about construction safety. She was perfect in those moments, a portrait of love under pressure. But I saw what happened when the cameras left. I saw how her smile would slip like a mask falling away. I saw how she'd flinch when he needed help getting dressed, how she'd find excuses to leave the room when he struggled with the simplest tasks. I watched love curdle into resentment, devotion sour into disgust. The first time she came home smelling of wine and expensive cologne, I said nothing. The second time, when she claimed she'd been at her sister's house but her sister called looking for her, I held my tongue. But the third time, when I found her on the phone in the garage, whispering promises to someone who wasn't her husband, I knew our family was under attack from within. "I can't do this anymore," she told whoever was on the other end of that line. "He's not the man I married. He's pathetic now. Broken. Broken." She called my son broken like he was a toy that had lost its usefulness, like his worth had been tied to his ability to climb scaffolding and swing hammers. In that moment, I understood that some people love conditionally, that their devotion has expiration dates and escape clauses. But what shattered my heart completely wasn't her betrayal. It was realizing that Mateo knew. He'd heard her whispering, seen her flinching, felt her pulling away, and instead of fighting for himself, he was accepting it. He was believing her version of his worth. That's when I knew the real war was just beginning. You want to know what rage feels like? It's not hot like they tell you in books. Real rage is cold, calculating, patient. It sits in your chest like ice, waiting for the perfect moment to shatter everything in its path. I felt that ice forming when Carla walked into our kitchen on a Tuesday morning in March, carrying divorce papers like she was delivering groceries. She set them on the table between Mateo's coffee cup and the medication he needed just to function, and she smiled, actually smiled, while she destroyed our family. "It's better this way," she said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey, "for everyone." My son read those papers with shaking hands, his face crumbling like old paper. When he got to the part about property division, he looked up at her with eyes that held 20 years of love and trust, and he asked the question that broke my heart. "You want the house?" "It's marital property, Mateo. I have rights." Rights. She talked about rights like she'd earned them, like she'd mixed the cement and laid the bricks, like she'd worked 16-hour days to make the mortgage payments. She talked about rights while sitting in the kitchen of a house she'd never appreciated, wearing jewelry my son had bought her with money he'd earned bleeding. "Mom," Mateo whispered, turning to me with tears streaming down his face. "Maybe she's right. Maybe it's fair." Fair. My son, my beautiful, broken son, was ready to give away his life's work because a woman who'd promised to love him in sickness and health had decided that sickness wasn't worth her time. I set down my teacup with hands that didn't shake, though my soul was screaming. When I spoke, my voice was quiet, controlled, deadly. "No, son, you don't understand. That house is your life's work. It's proof that you survived everything this world threw at you. And I will not let anyone steal it." Carla's smile faltered for the first time. She'd expected tears, pleading, maybe even acceptance. She hadn't expected to wake the dragon that had been sleeping in the corner of her kitchen for 3 years. "Elena, this is between Mateo and me," she said, but her voice had lost its confidence. "No," I said, standing slowly, feeling decades of buried power rising in my veins like floodwater. "This stopped being between you and my son the moment you decided to destroy him for sport. Now it's between you and me." She left that day with her papers unsigned and her confidence shaken. But I knew she'd be back with lawyers and leverage, with strategies designed to take apart everything we'd built. What she didn't know was that Elena Alvarez had been preparing for this war since the day she first held her son in her arms. What she didn't know was that some mothers don't just fight, they demolish. You know what they say about the dead coming back to life? It's never for the living. It's always for the reckoning. I sat in my bedroom that night after Carla left, surrounded by photo albums and legal documents, trying to decide if I was brave enough to become myself again. On my dresser sat a business card I'd kept for 20 years, yellowed with age but still legible. Hugo Ramirez, private investigator. Hugo had been a detective when I was Chicago's chief public defender, back when I was young and stupid enough to believe that justice was a river that flowed toward truth. We'd worked dozens of cases together, and he'd been one of the few cops who'd understood that sometimes the system needs someone willing to fight dirty to keep it clean. He'd also been there the night everything fell apart, the night I discovered that Judge Morrison was taking bribes from the very criminals I was trying to put away, the night I chose integrity over career and walked away from everything I'd built. I dialed his number with fingers that remembered muscle memory from a lifetime ago. The phone rang 3 times before his familiar gravelly voice answered. "Ramirez." Hugo, it's Elena Alvarez. Silence. Then, Jesus Christ, Elena, I thought you were dead. Close enough. I need a favor, Hugo. One last case. Another pause. What kind of favor? The kind that reminds the world why they used to fear my name. Hugo chuckled, and I could hear 20 years of history in that sound. What do you need? I told him about Carla, about the divorce, about my son's broken spirit and his ex-wife's sudden wealth. I told him about expensive clothes and mysterious phone calls, about a woman who'd married for love and was divorcing for profit. Give me a week, Hugo said. If she's dirty, I'll find the dirt. He found more than dirt. He found a goddamn archaeological dig of corruption. 7 days later, Hugo sat in my living room with a manila folder thick as a phone book, his face grim with the satisfaction of a hunter who'd tracked dangerous prey. Inside that folder was a love story, just not the kind Carla wanted anyone to read. Meet Richard Blackwell, real estate developer, married father of 3, and the sugar daddy funding Carla's new lifestyle. Bank records showed deposits into her account that coincided perfectly with their hotel meetings. Phone records revealed hours of intimate conversation, and photographs, God, the photographs, showed them together in restaurants, hotels, his penthouse apartment overlooking the lake. She's been planning this for 8 months, Hugo said, spreading the evidence across my coffee table like tarot cards revealing an ugly future. The accident gave her an excuse, but she was already looking for an exit strategy. But the evidence that made my blood sing with righteous fury was the recording Hugo had obtained through means I didn't ask about and he didn't volunteer. Carla's voice, clear as a church bell, instructing my 9-year-old granddaughter Sophia on what to say in court about her father's supposed incompetence. Remember, baby, Daddy can't take care of you anymore. He's too sick. Tell the judge you're scared to live with him. My granddaughter's small voice, confused and frightened. But I'm not scared, Mommy. Daddy's getting better. Sophia, listen to me. Do you want Mommy to be happy? Then you need to say what I told you to say. I listened to that recording 3 times, feeling something crystallize inside my chest. Not ice this time, but diamond. Hard, clear, unbreakable resolve. So this is how far greed will crawl, I whispered, staring at the evidence of my family's destruction spread across my coffee table. This is what passes for motherhood now? Hugo leaned back in his chair, studying my face with eyes that had seen too much human ugliness to be surprised anymore. What are you going to do? Elena. I looked at him across 20 years of silence and retirement, across decades of being dead to the world that had once trembled at my name. When I smiled, I felt muscles in my face that I'd forgotten how to use. I'm going to remind them why legends never really die, Hugo. I'm going to show them what happens when you poke a sleeping dragon. The day of the hearing arrived like Judgment Day. Gray skies and bitter cold, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones and stays there. I dressed in the same black suit I'd worn to my last trial 20 years ago, the one that had made opposing counsel sweat even before I opened my mouth. Carla's lawyer was a shark named Peterson, the kind of man who wore success like cologne and charged by the syllable. He strutted into that courtroom like he owned it. His briefcase stuffed with character assassinations and legal loopholes. Behind him followed Carla, playing the role of grieving wife to perfection, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue that had never seen real tears. Mateo sat at the defendant's table. And isn't that a goddamn tragedy that my son was the defendant in his own life, wearing his best suit, the one he'd bought for our last Christmas together when we still believed in happy endings. His crutches leaned against his chair like evidence of his supposed failure, and I wanted to burn them just so the jury couldn't use them to measure his worth. Peterson began his opening statement with the precision of a surgeon and the morality of a grave robber. He painted my son as a broken man living in the past, a danger to his own daughter, a dead weight holding back a woman who deserved better. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, Peterson said, his voice smooth as snake oil, We are here today because sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes, no matter how much we want to hold on to what we had, we must accept what we've become. He gestured toward Mateo with the kind of pity that's indistinguishable from contempt. Mr. Alvarez was once a capable man, a provider, a husband, but the unfortunate accident that befell him has rendered him incapable of maintaining the responsibilities that come with property ownership and child custody. Incapable. The word hung in the air like a curse, and I watched my son flinch as if he'd been struck. Peterson continued his character assassination with surgical precision, detailing every limitation, every struggle, every moment of weakness that my son had endured since his fall. Mrs. Alvarez, my client, has shown remarkable patience and dedication during her husband's recovery. But there comes a time when a woman must choose between enabling a man's decline and protecting her own future, and more importantly, the future of their child. Enabling. As if loving someone through their darkest hour was a weakness instead of the highest form of courage. But it was Carla's testimony that truly set my blood on fire. She took the stand dressed in widow's weeds, playing the part of the long-suffering wife with Academy Award precision. "I've tried to support Mateo through his recovery," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "But he's not the man I married. He's angry all the time, bitter about his limitations. I'm afraid of what he might do if he's pushed too far." Afraid. This woman who'd been cheating on my son while he relearned how to walk was claiming to be afraid of him. This predator in sheep's clothing was painting herself as the victim of a man who'd never raised his voice, let alone his hand, to anyone in his life. "I refuse to waste my life with a cripple," she said, the words slipping out before she could catch them, revealing the poison that had been festering beneath her careful facade. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of shock and disgust. Even Peterson looked like he wanted to disappear into his expensive suit. But Carla pressed on, doubling down on her cruelty like a gambler throwing good money after bad. I refuse to let my daughter grow up thinking that this kind of life is normal. She deserves better than a father who can't even take care of himself. That's when I stood up. Slowly, deliberately, feeling every eye in that courtroom turn toward me like sunflowers following the light. I walked to the defendant's table, set my vintage briefcase down with a sound that echoed through the chamber like a gavel, and spoke the words that would change everything. "Your Honor, my name is Elena Alvarez. I will represent my son." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear dust settling on the windowsills. Then Judge Harrison, a man who'd been practicing law since before I'd taken my first case, leaned forward in his chair, his face pale with recognition. "The Elena Alvarez?" he whispered. "Chicago's former chief public defender?" The gasps that rippled through the courtroom sounded like wind through a graveyard. Reporters frantically scribbled notes. Peterson's confident smirk disappeared like smoke in a hurricane. And Carla, beautiful, cruel Carla, looked like she'd seen a ghost, which, in a way, she had. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying the weight of 20 years of silence and a lifetime of fighting for the powerless. "I'm back." Peterson tried to object, claiming I wasn't licensed to practice in Wisconsin, that I hadn't practiced law in decades, that I was emotionally compromised. But Judge Harrison waved him off with the authority of a man who remembered what justice looked like when it had teeth. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said, and I could hear respect in his voice that made my heart sing with forgotten music. "You have special dispensation to represent your son in these proceedings. The court recognizes your unique qualifications." I smiled then, feeling muscles in my face that had been dormant for 2 decades. "Thank you, Your Honor. I promise you won't regret it." But as I looked across the aisle at Carla's shocked face, at Peterson's suddenly worried expression, I knew that they already did. You want to know what it feels like to build a case? Like you're building a cathedral? Stone by stone. Truth by truth. until you've constructed something so beautiful and terrible that it takes people's breath away. That's what I did to Carla. I dismantled her lies with the precision of a master craftsman, starting with the foundation and working my way up until her entire narrative collapsed under the weight of evidence. First, the deed. I walked to the evidence table like I was approaching an altar, holding the original property documents like they were sacred texts, because to my family, they were. Your Honor, I present Exhibit A, the deed to 1247 Maple Street, purchased by Mateo Alvarez on June 15, 2018, 6 months before his marriage to the plaintiff. I let that sink in, watching Peterson's face as he realized his client had lied to him about the timeline. Carla shifted in her seat like a snake shedding skin, her careful composure beginning to crack. According to Wisconsin's state law, I continued, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd memorized statutes before Peterson had learned to tie his shoes. Any property purchased prior to marriage remains the separate property of the purchaser, regardless of subsequent marital status. Peterson objected, of course, claimed that improvements made during the marriage, that joint mortgage payments, that a dozen other desperate arguments that sounded like a drowning man gasping for air. But the law was clear, and the law was on our side. Furthermore, I said, producing bank records with the flourish of a magician, revealing a trick. All mortgage payments, all property taxes, all maintenance costs were paid exclusively from Mr. Alvarez's accounts, using funds from his construction business. Mrs. Carla Alvarez contributed exactly $0 to the purchase or maintenance of this property. $0. The number hung in the air like an accusation, and I watched Carla's supporters in the gallery begin to whisper among themselves. Even her own family looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats like they were sitting on hot coals. But the deed was just the appetizer. The main course was about to be served. Your Honor, I now present Exhibit B, a recording obtained legally through private investigation, in which Mrs. Carla Alvarez instructs her 9-year-old daughter to commit perjury before this court. The courtroom fell silent as my granddaughter's voice filled the chamber through speakers that turned her childhood innocence into an indictment of her mother's corruption. I watched the jury's faces as they heard Carla coaching Sophia to lie, to claim she was afraid of her father, to betray the man who'd read her bedtime stories and taught her to ride a bicycle. When the recording ended, the silence was so complete you could have heard a pin drop in the parking lot. Several jury members were openly weeping. One woman in the front row looked at Carla with the kind of disgust usually reserved for child molesters and politicians. This recording, I said, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest, reveals a woman so consumed with greed that she was willing to traumatize her own daughter, to turn a child into a weapon against her father. Peterson was on his feet, objecting to everything, the recording's admissibility, its relevance, its authenticity. But his voice lacked conviction. Even he looked sick, listening to his client destroy her own daughter's innocence for financial gain. But I wasn't done, not even close. Your Honor, I present Exhibit C, photographic evidence, bank records, and phone logs documenting Mrs. Carla Alvarez's adulterous relationship with real estate developer Richard Blackwell. The photographs hit the courtroom like bombs. Carla and her lover in intimate embraces, sharing expensive dinners, emerging from hotel rooms with the guilty satisfaction of people who thought they were above consequences. Bank deposits that coincided perfectly with their rendezvous, phone records showing hours of late-night conversations while my son slept in the next room, recovering from surgeries and believing in a love that was already dead. These records show, I continued, spreading the evidence across the table like tarot cards revealing an ugly future, that Mrs. Alvarez has been conducting this affair for 8 months, receiving financial support from Mr. Blackwell, and planning her exit strategy from her marriage since before her husband's accident had even fully healed. Carla was no longer the composed woman who'd walked into court that morning. Her makeup was running, Her carefully styled hair was disheveled, and her hands shook as she gripped the edge of the witness stand. She looked like what she was, a con artist whose con had been exposed. But the final nail in her coffin, the piece of evidence that made the jury gasp and the judge lean forward in his chair, was the financial records Hugo had uncovered. Your Honor, these bank statements show that Mrs. Alvarez has been systematically draining the joint accounts she shared with my son, transferring money to personal accounts that Mr. Alvarez had no knowledge of. The total amount stolen from their marital assets is $47,000, money that was earmarked for my son's medical care and rehabilitation. $47,000. Stolen while her husband lay in a hospital bed, fighting to regain the use of his legs. Stolen while he attended physical therapy and worried about providing for his family. Stolen by the woman who'd sworn to love him in sickness and health. Peterson was pale as death, frantically whispering to his client, probably wondering how he'd let himself get attached to such a spectacular train wreck. But Carla just sat there, staring at the evidence of her own greed laid out like a buffet of corruption. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," I said, turning to face them with the confidence of someone who'd just proven every word of her case. "This is not a divorce proceeding. This is a robbery interrupted. This is a predator being stopped before she can complete her feast." And then, like a gift from the universe itself, my granddaughter, Sophia, walked into that courtroom. You want to know what innocence sounds like when it speaks truth to power? It sounds like a 9-year-old girl with pigtails and a voice that could break your heart, walking into a courtroom full of adults who'd forgotten what honesty looked like. Sophia had been staying with her aunt during the proceedings. Carla's attempt to control the narrative by keeping witnesses away from the truth. But my private investigator had a conversation with that aunt, and suddenly Sophia was walking through those courtroom doors in her Sunday dress, holding her aunt's hand and looking for her daddy. When she saw Mateo sitting at the defendant's table, her face lit up like Christmas morning. She broke free from her aunt's grip and ran to him, throwing her small arms around his neck with the fierce love that only children can give. "Daddy!" she cried, and the sound echoed through that courtroom like a bell-tolling judgment. "I missed you so much." I watched my son hold his daughter, watched his shoulders shake with tears he'd been holding back for months. This was what Carla wanted to destroy, this pure, uncomplicated love between a father and his child. Judge Harrison called Sophia to the witness stand with the gentle voice of a grandfather who understood that sometimes truth comes from the mouths of babes. She climbed into that chair, looking so small, so vulnerable, but when she spoke, her voice carried the power of absolute honesty. "Sophia," I said, approaching the witness stand with the careful reverence of someone addressing an angel, "do you know why you're here today?" She nodded solemnly. "Mommy and Daddy are getting divorced. Mommy says I have to choose who to live with." "And who do you want to live with, sweetheart?" "Both of them," she said, and the simple honesty of it made several jury members reach for tissues. "But if I have to choose just one, I want to stay with Daddy and Grandma Elena." The words hit Carla like physical blows. She actually flinched, her hand flying to her chest, as if Sophia had reached across the courtroom and struck her. "Can you tell us why, Sophia?" My granddaughter's voice was clear as crystal, innocent as morning dew. "Because Daddy reads me stories and helps me with my homework. He makes me pancakes in funny shapes and tells me jokes when I'm sad. Mommy is always on her phone talking to Uncle Richard. She doesn't play with me anymore." Uncle Richard. Out of the mouths of babes comes the most damning testimony of all. "Sophia," I continued, feeling my heart break and soar simultaneously, "did Mommy ask you to say anything special to the judge today?" She nodded, her small face scrunching with confusion. "She told me to say I was scared of Daddy, but I'm not scared. Daddy's gentle. He wouldn't hurt anyone." "Did Mommy tell you why she wanted you to say that?" "She said it would make her happy if I said Daddy was dangerous. But it's not true, Grandma Elena. Daddy cries sometimes because his leg hurts, but he never gets angry at me." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of people weeping. I turned to look at the jury and saw 12 faces filled with righteous anger, not at my son, but at the woman who'd tried to use her own daughter as a weapon. When I glanced at Carla, she was slumped in her chair like a marionette with cut strings. Her lawyer wasn't even trying to object anymore. What could he say? How do you cross-examine a child who's telling the truth with the clarity that only innocence can provide? "Sophia," I said, kneeling down so I was at her eye level, "is there anything else you want to tell the judge?" She looked past me to where her mother sat, and for a moment, I saw sadness replace the joy in her young eyes. "I just want Mommy to stop being angry all the time. I want her to love Daddy again like she used to." And there it was, the testimony that reduced grown men to tears and made hardened courtroom reporters stop writing to wipe their eyes. A child's pure wish for her broken family to heal, delivered with the kind of honesty that cuts through lies like sunlight through fog. When Sophia climbed down from the witness stand and ran back to her father's arms, I knew we'd won more than a case. We'd reclaimed truth itself from the thieves who'd tried to steal it. But Carla, desperate and cornered like a wounded animal, was about to make one last attempt to destroy us all. Desperation makes people dangerous. Cornered animals lash out with whatever weapons they have left, and Carla, beautiful, cruel Carla, still had one bullet in her chamber. She was about to fire it directly at my heart. When Peterson called his final witness, I knew what was coming. You don't practice law for 30 years without recognizing the smell of a character assassination from across the courtroom. He was going to try to destroy my credibility, to make the jury question whether I was fit to represent my own son. "Your Honor," Peterson said, his voice dripping with the false sincerity of a snake oil salesman, "I call Richard Morrison to the stand." Richard Morrison. The name hit me like a punch to the solar plexus, bringing back memories I'd spent 20 years trying to forget. He walked into that courtroom wearing an expensive suit and the smug confidence of a man who thought his past sins had been buried deep enough to stay hidden. Morrison had been the judge, the dirty judge who'd taken bribes from organized crime, who'd perverted justice for personal gain, who'd forced me to choose between my career and my conscience. When I'd exposed his corruption 20 years ago, it had cost me everything I'd worked for. But seeing him now, older and grayer, but still radiating the entitled arrogance of a man who thought he was above consequences, I felt that old fire rekindle in my chest. Peterson's strategy was simple. If you can't attack the evidence, attack the messenger. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "you worked with Elena Alvarez during her time as chief public defender, did you not?" "I did," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who'd spent decades lying from positions of power. "And can you tell the court about the circumstances of Mrs. Alvarez's departure from that position?" Morrison leaned back in the witness chair like he was holding court at his private club. Elena Alvarez left the public defender's office under a cloud of scandal. She made wild accusations against sitting judges, disrupted ongoing cases with her conspiracy theories, and ultimately resigned in disgrace when she couldn't prove her outlandish claims. Conspiracy theories, wild accusations, disgrace. Each word was a knife thrust designed to bleed out my credibility in front of the jury. I watched their faces, saw doubt creeping in like poison, and felt 20 years of buried rage begin to surface. But Peterson wasn't finished. He was going for the kill shot. "In your professional opinion, Mr. Morrison, is Elena Alvarez mentally stable enough to represent a client in a court of law?" The question hung in the air like a noose, and I felt the walls of the courtroom closing in around me. This was their play. Paint me as a delusional old woman chasing shadows, make the jury question every piece of evidence I'd presented. Morrison smiled with the cold satisfaction of a man who thought he was about to bury his accuser once and for all. In my opinion, Elena Alvarez is a dangerous fantasist who sees corruption where none exists. Her paranoid delusions cost her career 20 years ago, and I suspect they're what brought her here today. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. I could see doubt spreading through the jury like a virus, could feel my carefully constructed case beginning to crumble under the weight of character assassination. That's when Carla made her final mistake. Emboldened by Morrison's testimony, drunk on the possibility of victory, she stood up in the gallery and screamed the words that would destroy her. "She's a fraud. She left law in disgrace. She's nothing but a bitter old woman who can't accept that her time is over." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Judge Harrison banged his gavel, calling for order, but Carla wasn't finished. 20 years of entitlement and 3 months of fear poured out of her like poison from a lanced wound. "She doesn't belong here. She's washed up, irrelevant. She should have stayed buried where she belongs." Buried. The word echoed through the chamber like a death knell, and in that moment I felt something ancient and terrible awakening inside me. I stood slowly, feeling every eye in that courtroom turn toward me, feeling the weight of 2 decades of silence pressing down on my shoulders. When I spoke, my voice was quiet, controlled, deadly. Yes, I left law 20 years ago, and yes, it was because of Richard Morrison. I turned to face Morrison, who was no longer smiling. "But not for the reasons he's told you." Judge Harrison leaned forward, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Mrs. Alvarez, please continue." "I left because I discovered that Judge Morrison was taking bribes from the Torino crime family. I left because I found evidence that he was fixing cases, selling verdicts to the highest bidder, turning our entire justice system into his personal auction house." Morrison's face went white as death. Peterson was on his feet, objecting frantically, but I pressed on. 20 years of suppressed truth pouring out like water from a broken dam. I left because when I presented that evidence to the State Bar Association, to the Attorney General, to anyone who would listen, I was told to keep quiet. I was told that exposing one corrupt judge would undermine faith in the entire system. I was given a choice: stay silent and keep my career, or speak truth and lose everything. The courtroom was silent as a tomb. Even the reporters had stopped writing, transfixed by the confession of a woman who'd sacrificed everything for principle. I chose truth. I chose justice over career, integrity over success. And yes, it cost me everything I'd worked for, but I'd rather be a disgraced defender of justice than a successful enabler of corruption. I turned to face the jury, feeling power flowing through my veins like electricity. 20 years ago, I was branded a whistleblower, a troublemaker, a woman who wouldn't stay in her place. Today, I wear those labels like medals of honor. Morrison was sweating now, his composed facade cracking like old paint. He knew what was coming, knew that his past was about to catch up with him in the most public way possible. "Your Honor," I said, reaching into my briefcase and producing a folder thick with documents. "I present Exhibit D FBI Case File 2005-47291, documenting the federal investigation that ultimately resulted in Judge Morrison's resignation and conviction for racketeering and bribery." The explosion of gasps and whispers that filled the courtroom sounded like thunder. Morrison lunged for the witness stand like he was going to flee, but he was trapped, pinned down by the weight of his own crimes, finally seeing daylight. "The same FBI investigation," I continued, my voice rising with righteous fury, "that vindicated every accusation I made 20 years ago. The same investigation that proved I wasn't a delusional fantasist. I was the only person brave enough to call a criminal what he was." Judge Harrison, the same Judge Harrison who'd been a young attorney when Morrison's empire fell, stood up at the bench, his face pale with recognition and shame. "Mr. Morrison," he said, his voice trembling with controlled anger, "you were convicted of federal crimes. You served 18 months in federal prison. How dare you come into my courtroom and perjure yourself about the woman who exposed your corruption?" Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. The man who'd walked into that courtroom radiating arrogant confidence was now revealed as exactly what he'd always been, a criminal whose time had finally run out. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Reporters rushed for the doors, racing to file stories about the bombshell revelation. Peterson looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. And Carla, beautiful, cruel Carla, sat in stunned silence, realizing that her final weapon had not only failed to destroy me, it had revealed the true scope of my power. When the noise finally died down, I turned to face the jury one last time. 12 faces looked back at me with expressions ranging from awe to respect to outright admiration. They weren't seeing a disgraced former attorney anymore. They were seeing exactly what I'd always been, a woman who'd sacrificed everything to stand up for what was right. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," I said, my voice carrying the weight of vindication and the promise of justice, "I left law 20 years ago because I refused to be complicit in corruption. I stayed away because I believed my fight was over. But I'm here today because some fights are worth coming back from the dead for." I gestured toward my son, toward my granddaughter, toward the family that Carla had tried to destroy for profit. This is one of those fights, and I promise you, on everything I've sacrificed and everything I've endured, that justice will not sleep today. When I sat down, the silence in that courtroom was so complete you could have heard angels weeping. But in that silence, I heard something else, the sound of truth finally being heard, of justice finally awakening from its long sleep. The war was won. Now all that remained was the verdict. You want to know what justice sounds like when it finally speaks? It sounds like a gavel falling on marble, like thunder rolling across a clear sky, like the voice of God calling the faithful home. Judge Harrison took exactly 47 minutes to deliberate. 47 minutes that felt like 47 years. I sat next to my son, holding his hand while my granddaughter drew pictures of our family on legal paper, her crayons creating the future I prayed we'd still have when this nightmare ended. Carla sat across the aisle looking like a woman who'd seen her own grave, her expensive clothes rumpled, her perfect makeup streaked with tears that might have been real. Peterson whispered furiously in her ear, probably explaining how thoroughly they'd been destroyed, how completely their case had collapsed. When the judge returned, the entire courtroom held its breath. This wasn't just about a divorce anymore. This was about whether truth still mattered in a world that seemed increasingly comfortable with lies. "In the matter of Alvarez versus Alvarez," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "this court finds the following." Each word fell like a hammer blow, shaping the future with the precision of divine judgment. First, regarding the property in question. The house at 1247 Maple Street was purchased by Mateo Alvarez prior to his marriage and remains his separate property. Mrs. Carla Alvarez has no legal claim to this asset. I felt Mateo's hand tighten in mine, felt 20 years of sacrificed dreams being restored with a single sentence. Second, regarding custody of the minor child Sofia Alvarez. Based on the evidence presented, including the recording of Mrs. Carla Alvarez coaching the child to commit perjury, custody is awarded to Mateo Alvarez, with Elena Alvarez serving as guardian. Mrs. B. Carla Alvarez will be granted supervised visitation only, pending psychological evaluation. Sophia looked up from her drawing, her young face bright with understanding that she'd be going home with her daddy and grandma. She smiled with the pure joy that only children can feel, untainted by the adult corruption that had tried to destroy her family. Third, regarding the financial malfeasance documented in this case, Mrs. Carla Alvarez is ordered to return the $47,000 stolen from marital accounts, plus interest and penalties. Additionally, she will bear all court costs and attorney fees for both parties. Each ruling hit Carla like a physical blow. She slumped further in her chair with every word, watching her carefully planned future crumble into dust and bitter regret. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Carla with the kind of moral authority that makes criminals tremble. Furthermore, this court is referring the matter of perjury and attempted subornation of perjury to the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Prosecution. Mrs. Carla Alvarez, you attempted to use your own child as a weapon against her father. That is not just morally reprehensible, it is criminal. The courtroom erupted in applause. Actual applause, like we were at a theater watching justice triumph over evil. Reporters scribbled frantically, understanding that they were witnessing something rare and beautiful, a system working exactly as it was designed to work. When the gavel fell for the final time, when Judge Harrison declared the proceedings closed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 20 years. Complete, total, overwhelming victory. Not just legal victory, but moral victory. The victory of truth over lies, of love over greed, of family over predation. Mateo turned to me with tears streaming down his face, his voice broken with gratitude and disbelief. "Mom, we won. We actually won." But I knew better. This wasn't a victory. This was a restoration. We hadn't won anything. We'd simply reclaimed what had always been ours. Our dignity, our family, our right to live without fear of those who would devour us for sport. Sophia threw her arms around both of us, creating a circle of love that no amount of money could buy, no legal maneuver could break. In that moment, surrounded by the evidence of justice and the promise of tomorrow, I understood why I'd been willing to come back from the dead. Some battles are worth fighting, even if the cost is everything you have. Some families are worth saving, even if the saving requires resurrection. Some truths are worth speaking, even if the speaking demands that you rise from your own grave. As we walked out of that courtroom, past the cameras and the reporters and the crowds of supporters who'd gathered to witness justice, I heard someone in the gallery whisper, "That's Elena Alvarez. The Elena Alvarez, I thought she was dead." I smiled, feeling alive for the first time in 20 years. "I was," I whispered back, "but some things are too important to stay buried." Behind us, Carla sat alone at the plaintiff's table, abandoned by her lawyer, her lover, her dreams of easy money. She'd gambled everything on greed and lost it all to love. Justice may sleep, but it never dies. And when it wakes up hungry. You want to know what victory tastes like? It tastes like Sunday morning pancakes in a kitchen filled with laughter, like coffee that doesn't have to be rationed, like the sweet air of a home that belongs to you and can never be stolen again. 3 months after the trial, I stood in that same kitchen where Carla had served divorce papers, like they were death warrants, watching my son teach his daughter how to flip pancakes. His movements were still careful, still compensated for his limitations, but there was strength in them now, the strength of a man who knew his worth wasn't measured by his physical capabilities. Carla had vanished like smoke after the verdict. Her wealthy lover, Richard Blackwell, had abandoned her the moment her name appeared in the newspapers connected to fraud and perjury charges. Turns out rich men who cheat on their wives don't appreciate being exposed in federal court. Who could have predicted that? The criminal charges were still pending. Perjury, attempted subornation of perjury, theft of marital assets. The district attorney was treating her case like a master class in how not to conduct yourself during divorce proceedings. Her lawyer had quietly suggested she consider a plea deal that involved returning to her home state and never darkening Wisconsin's doorway again. Some people called it exile. I called it garbage taking itself out. But this story isn't about Carla's downfall. It's about Mateo's resurrection. 3 months after the trial, my son was walking without crutches, not running marathons, not climbing scaffolding, but walking with his own strength through his own house on his own land. The physical therapy that Carla had complained about, that she'd seen as evidence of his weakness, had slowly rebuilt not just his body but his spirit. "Mom," he said one evening, as we sat on the front porch, watching Sophia play in the yard. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't come back." I didn't want to think about that alternative timeline, the one where my son lost his house, his daughter, his dignity to a woman who'd seen his vulnerability as an opportunity for profit, the one where Sophia grew up believing her father was weak, where Mateo spent the rest of his life convinced he deserved to be abandoned. "But I did come back," I said, watching my granddaughter chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Some things are too important to leave to chance. The house itself had become something of a local landmark. Tour groups of law students came by occasionally, professors using our case as an example of how the system could work when justice and preparation collided with corruption and greed. They called it the Alvarez vindication in legal journals, a textbook example of how proper evidence presentation could overcome even the most sophisticated character assassination. I found their academic interest amusing. To them, this was a case study. To us, it was our lives. The money Carla had stolen was returned with interest, as ordered by the court. We used part of it to build a wheelchair ramp, not because Mateo needed it anymore, but because someday he might, and that was okay. Disability wasn't defeat, it was just another way of being human. The rest we put into Sophia's college fund, ensuring that she'd have opportunities that couldn't be stolen by anyone's greed. Hugo Ramirez became a regular visitor, stopping by for coffee and war stories about the old days when justice was something we fought for instead of something we hoped for. He'd aged well, my old partner in the pursuit of truth, and he seemed energized by our victory in a way that reminded me why we'd become investigators and attorneys in the first place. "You know," he said one afternoon, sitting at our kitchen table with evidence folders spread around him like tarot cards, "we've got 3 other cases that could use the Elena Alvarez touch. Families being destroyed by predators, justice being perverted by money and influence." I looked at those folders, felt that old fire stirring in my chest like embers that had never quite died. For 20 years. I told myself my fighting days were over, that I'd sacrificed enough for other people's justice. But watching my son rebuild his life, watching my granddaughter grow up safe and loved in a house that belonged to us, I realized something. Some people retire from justice. Others realize that justice is not a job, it's a calling. 3 cases? I asked, reaching for the first folder with hands that remembered the weight of fighting for the powerless. Hugo smiled with the satisfaction of a hunter who'd found his lost pack. 3 families that need a miracle. 3 situations where the system has failed and the predators think they've won. I opened the first file, saw photographs of another broken family, another house being stolen, another child being used as a weapon. My blood began to sing with the old familiar music of righteous anger. "Well," I said, feeling Elena Alvarez, the real Elena Alvarez, fully awakening for the first time in 2 decades, "it seems reports of my retirement have been greatly exaggerated." Outside, Sophia's laughter echoed through the evening air like a promise, like a reminder that some things are worth fighting for no matter how tired you are, no matter how long you've been sleeping. The dragon was awake, and she was hungry for justice. You want to know what I learned from rising from the dead? I learned that legends don't die. They just wait for the right moment to remind the world why they became legends in the first place. I'm sitting here now, 6 months after that trial, in the same kitchen where this story began. But everything has changed. The house that was once threatened is now secure, protected not just by law, but by the knowledge that some things are worth fighting for. The family that was nearly destroyed has been healed, not perfectly, but genuinely. Mateo is back at work. modified construction, consulting instead of climbing, but work that honors his skills and experience. He's dating again, carefully, thoughtfully, with the wisdom of a man who's learned the difference between love and predation. When he brings women home to meet us, I watch their faces when they see his crutches, when they hear about his limitations. The ones who flinch, who calculate his worth based on his physical capabilities, don't get invited back. Sophia has nightmares sometimes, not about her father, but about the mother who tried to teach her that love was conditional, that family was something to be bartered and sold. We're working through that with a therapist who understands that some wounds take time to heal. But every morning when she comes down for breakfast, when she hugs her father and tells him about her dreams, I see her healing a little more. As for me, I'm busier than I've been in 20 years. Hugo was right about those other cases, and news of our victory is spread through the networks of people who fight for families under attack. My phone rings constantly now. Lawyers seeking consultation, families seeking representation, reporters wanting to know if the legend is really back. I tell them all the same thing. Elena Alvarez never left. She was just waiting for the right war. But this isn't really a story about me. It's a story about what happens when good people decide they've had enough. When families under attack remember that they have claws and teeth. When justice awakens from its long sleep, hungry for truth. Sometimes the people who hurt us think they're teaching us lessons about powerlessness. Sometimes they think our pain is proof of their superiority, our struggles, evidence of their right to devour us. But what they don't understand is that some people don't break under pressure. They transform. The woman who walked into that courtroom wasn't the same one who'd walked away from law 20 years ago. 20 years of silence had taught me patience. 20 years of watching my son struggle had taught me the true cost of justice. 20 years of being dismissed as irrelevant had taught me the power of being underestimated. Carla thought she was destroying a broken man and his delusional mother. What she actually did was wake up a force of nature that had been hibernating, waiting for a reason to care about justice again. The law bends sometimes. It gets twisted by money and influence, corrupted by greed and power. Politicians sell it, judges pervert it, lawyers weaponize it for the highest bidder. But truth? Truth is unbreakable. Truth is patient. Truth waits in the shadows for its moment to strike, and when it does, it doesn't just wound, it eviscerates. I want you to remember that the next time someone tries to convince you that might makes right, that money trumps justice, that the powerful will always prey on the vulnerable. Remember Elena Alvarez, who chose integrity over career and found that integrity has its own kind of power. Remember Mateo Alvarez, who loved unconditionally and was rewarded with a family worth fighting for. Remember Sophia Alvarez, who spoke truth when adults around her trafficked in lies. Remember that some stories have happy endings not because the universe is kind, but because good people decide to make them happy by refusing to surrender to evil. Now I want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell me. If you were in my place, would you have stayed silent for 20 years, or would you have fought from the beginning? If someone tried to steal your family's future, how far would you go to protect what you love? Have you ever had to choose between what was easy and what was right? Tell me your stories of standing up to bullies, of protecting your family, of choosing the hard path because it was the right path. Tell me about the times you surprised yourself with your own strength, when you discovered that you were braver than you knew. Because here's what I know after 7 decades on this earth. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something else is more important than fear. Justice isn't a river that flows naturally toward truth. It's a dam that we build, stone by stone, case by case, choice by choice. And family? Family isn't just blood. It's the people willing to walk through fire for each other, the ones who see your worst moments and love you anyway, the ones who believe in your worth even when you've forgotten it yourself. 6 months ago, I was a dead woman walking through a world that had forgotten my name. Today, I'm Elena Alvarez again. Not the woman I was, but the woman I was always meant to become. Older, wiser, angrier, and absolutely unbreakable. The phone is ringing again. Another family under attack, another predator who thinks vulnerability is invitation, another chance to prove that justice may sleep, but it never dies. I'm going to answer that phone, because the dragon is awake now, and she remembers why she learned to breathe fire in the first place. Some wars end, others just find new battlefields. Watch for my next story, 2 families that thought justice was dead until it knocked on their door. Because Elena Alvarez is back, and she's got 20 years of suppressed rage to work through. Justice may bend, but truth never breaks, and neither do the people who serve it.